Hey, friends! I'm Megan, so glad you're here. We've got a great episode today. Let's get started.
From the very beginning, she approached love as if it were a game, a puzzle to be solved, a series of tests to measure someone else's devotion while hiding her own. She thrived on unpredictability, delighting in the thrill of seeing how far he would go, how much patience he possessed, and how willing he was to accommodate her whims. Every compliment she offered was calculated, every small act of attention weighed against the emotional advantage it might afford her, and every moment of vulnerability was metered, shared only to see his reaction. Her interactions were laced with subtle manipulations, playful challenges, and occasional teasing designed to provoke, test, and entertain rather than to build a genuine connection. She considered herself clever, perceptive, and charming, believing that she could maintain control over the emotional landscape while keeping him invested, unaware that in her hands, love had become a chessboard rather than a shared bond. She observed his every move, noting how he anticipated her desires, adjusted to her moods, and absorbed her occasional irritability with an almost effortless patience. To her, his devotion was a tool, a resource to be managed and assessed, and she rarely stopped to appreciate the extraordinary consistency behind his actions. His willingness to invest in her happiness, to support her without complaint, and to offer kindness without expectation was invisible to her, assumed as a given and, therefore, unremarkable. Weekends became opportunities for her to indulge in self-interest while he maintained the delicate balance of their daily life, attending to chores, planning meals, and navigating social obligations with a calm attentiveness she had come to take for granted. She focused on her amusement, her own satisfaction, and the subtle thrill of maintaining the upper hand in their interactions, oblivious to the quiet generosity that underpinned her comfort. Small gestures, notes left on the counter, reminders of appointments, or unexpected acts of service were met with fleeting acknowledgement at best, and more often than not, ignored entirely. As she moved through her days wrapped in the illusion that relationships were about control, observation, and clever maneuvering rather than mutual respect, support, and care. Friends occasionally commented on his patience and the extraordinary ways he adapted to her moods, but she would nod politely, dismissing their observations as exaggerations or simply failing to grasp their significance. She believed that her approach was harmless, even playful, never considering that her detachment and subtle manipulations were slowly eroding the natural reciprocity that underlies trust and intimacy. Each calculated reaction, each playful test, and each unacknowledged act of kindness accumulated invisibly, creating a fragile foundation of love and patience upon which she relied without understanding its rarity or value. Every morning, she woke to his attentiveness. Every evening, she returned to the quiet consistency of his care, and yet she saw it only as background noise, a predictable rhythm she had no need to consider or respect. In her mind, the game was entertaining, and she was winning. She could provoke, manipulate, and challenge, yet he remained steadfast, patient, and committed. What she did not see was the remarkable constancy of his actions, the rare patience that had allowed him to tolerate tests, teasing, and subtle manipulation without resentment, and the silent reserves of care he drew upon to maintain the connection she treated as trivial. Every overlooked gesture, every dismissed moment of attentiveness, and every instance of unreciprocated effort was a testament to the rarity of his kindness and the emotional labor he performed effortlessly. And while she reveled in the thrill of the game, she remained blind to the true depth of the bond she was so casually toying with, unaware that beneath her amusement and calculated detachment lay a foundation of trust, patience, and rare devotion that might one day demand acknowledgement she had yet to grant. As the weeks passed, her playful games continued, yet subtle cracks began to appear in the seamlessness she had always assumed would persist. At first, she barely noticed them: a delayed reply, a muted enthusiasm, a hesitation before offering help, but they were there, faint echoes of a growing awareness on his part that her teasing, manipulations, and emotional tests were not harmless. He continued to offer patience and support, but now it came with careful measurement, a quiet boundary that had been invisible before. She began to feel, though she could not yet name it, a subtle shift in the rhythm of their interactions, a delicate tension that made her increasingly aware of the real consequences her behavior could have. His attention, once automatic, now required her acknowledgement, and she began to notice the effort behind the gestures she had previously taken for granted. When he anticipated her needs or adjusted his plans to accommodate her whims, she felt a faint pang of guilt, realizing that these acts were not trivial but deliberate and thoughtful choices that demanded both emotional and practical energy. She observed him at social gatherings, noting the quiet ways he maintained composure while she laughed, teased, and tested, and slowly began to see the constancy of his patience as something extraordinary rather than ordinary. At home, she noticed the small but significant signs: the carefully prepared meals, the errands he completed without complaint, and the countless tiny adjustments he made to smooth over friction that she herself had instigated. Each act was a reminder of the rare generosity he offered without expectation, a generosity she had largely ignored in her pursuit of amusement. Moments of frustration or irritation on her part, which previously elicited immediate compliance or reassurance, now met with subtle resistance or gentle redirection, signaling a shift from unconditional patience to measured attention. She began to feel the first real weight of responsibility for the emotional environment she had shaped through her games, a recognition that her amusement had relied on his extraordinary tolerance and that continuing unchecked could fracture the foundation they had built together. As she reflected on specific incidents, the times she had tested his limits, exaggerated her dissatisfaction, or created unnecessary drama, she began to understand the emotional energy he had expended to maintain calm and continuity, often without recognition. Friends and acquaintances occasionally noted his remarkable patience, commenting on his steadiness, thoughtfulness, and resilience, and she started to grasp that what she had assumed to be ordinary was in fact extraordinary, a rarity that few could sustain over time. She felt a growing sense of admiration mixed with guilt, a complex emotional cocktail that made her question the casual way she had treated him and the subtle emotional games she had played. Every small act he performed now seemed loaded with intentionality. Each meal prepared, each errand run, each moment of attentive listening was no longer invisible to her eyes. She recognized for the first time that sustaining this level of care, patience, and consistency was a rare quality, one that could not be assumed as permanent or inexhaustible. The realization pressed upon her, creating both anxiety and introspection. She began to replay the weeks and months of her behavior, recognizing patterns of manipulation and neglect, and understanding that her amusement had depended on his tolerance and unwavering commitment. The casual way she had treated love now seemed dangerous, fragile, and unsustainable, and she felt the first stirrings of genuine concern for the consequences. Small lapses in his patience, subtle emotional distancing, and measured responses made her acutely aware that the games she had enjoyed could not continue indefinitely without cost. She began to recognize the delicate balance he maintained, the constant, quiet effort required to navigate her whims and maintain harmony, and the extraordinary depth of his character that had allowed him to endure her manipulations with grace. In private reflection, she catalogued his acts of care, the morning routines, the anticipatory gestures, the emotional support offered without complaint, and felt the first true pangs of regret. Each memory highlighted not only his generosity but also her own obliviousness, creating a mounting awareness that she had been blind to the rarity of his kindness. The growing understanding was unsettling. She realized that her playful games had real impact, that her casual disregard had consequences, and that the foundation of patience and care she had relied upon was not limitless. As the chapter progressed, her recognition deepened, and she began to internalize the subtle shift in their relationship, understanding that the extraordinary patience he displayed could not be taken for granted, and that her awareness and appreciation were overdue. The quiet, steady generosity that had allowed her to treat the relationship as a game now demanded acknowledgement, gratitude, and active care, or it risked slipping beyond her reach entirely. The turning point arrived gradually, almost imperceptibly, yet its impact was undeniable. She began to notice the subtle ways he had begun to withdraw, not abruptly, not with anger or confrontation, but with a quiet recalibration of his attention and energy. The gestures she had once taken for granted, the notes left on the counter, the meals prepared without comment, the constant anticipation of her moods were now delivered with pauses, deliberate timing, and a consciousness that had previously been invisible to her. At first, she interpreted these changes as fatigue, work stress, or minor distractions, never considering that they were a response to her own behavior, a gentle assertion of boundaries long neglected. The casual games, playful manipulations, and subtle tests she had enjoyed for months now carried weight, and she could feel the shift in their dynamic as he began to measure his investment, conserving emotional energy that she had previously assumed was infinite. In moments alone, she replayed interactions with new clarity, recognizing patterns of her own negligence, the teasing that had gone too far, the emotional withdrawals she had provoked, the occasions she had prioritized amusement over genuine engagement. Each memory struck with a growing sense of accountability, as she realized that what she had treated lightly had required extraordinary patience and attention to sustain. Social interactions magnified this awareness. Friends and family, long observers of his unwavering patience and steady support, began to comment on subtle changes in his demeanor, less laughter at her jokes, measured attention, a slight hesitation before committing to her requests. For the first time, she perceived the rarity of his qualities not as background noise but as extraordinary, finite resources she had assumed were limitless. The realization was unsettling. She felt a quiet panic rise within her as she confronted the consequences of her cavalier approach. The games she had played were not without cost, and the consistency of his patience, so long invisible, had limits she had never considered. Every subtle act of withdrawal, a delayed response, a measured tone, a careful pause before offering help served as a mirror, reflecting the inattention she had previously allowed to go unchecked. Her amusement, once unchecked and light-hearted, now collided with the sobering truth that her behavior had tangible effects on someone whose care had been rare and extraordinary. She began to catalogue, in her mind, the ways he had consistently prioritized her well-being, accommodated her whims, and absorbed her inconsistencies. The depth of his patience, once invisible, now appeared monumental, and the realization of its fragility brought with it a mixture of awe, fear, and emerging regret. At home, the shift in dynamics became impossible to ignore. Tasks that had once been accomplished effortlessly, often before she even requested, now required small cues, verbal acknowledgement, or gentle prompting. The ease of his attentiveness had been replaced by a measured, intentional engagement, as if he were quietly testing whether she had begun to recognize and value what she had previously treated as trivial. Emotional reckoning deepened when she reflected on the cumulative effect of her games. The playful manipulations, The teasing, the tests of devotion all had exacted a subtle toll over time, eroding the effortless flow of care that had been the foundation of their relationship. She began to feel the absence of unquestioned generosity and the weight of delayed attention, noticing how much she had relied upon it without acknowledgement or gratitude. Internal guilt grew alongside a newfound admiration. She saw clearly now that sustaining such patience and attention required deliberate effort and emotional resilience, qualities she had failed to recognize until confronted by their partial withdrawal. Each act that had once seemed ordinary now revealed itself as extraordinary, each instance of care a rare demonstration of commitment and empathy. The recognition was both humbling and urgent, compelling her to confront the reality that her previous behavior had jeopardized the delicate balance of their relationship. She began to strategize, not in manipulation or games, but in ways to genuinely acknowledge, appreciate, and reciprocate the care she had taken for granted. Moments of vulnerability became real rather than performative, gestures of gratitude deliberate rather than casual, and her awareness of the rarity of his patience informed every interaction. As the chapter progressed, the tension between past negligence and present realization defined her experience. Every interaction now carried the weight of acknowledgement, every gesture an opportunity to honor the extraordinary commitment he had maintained. The turning point was not dramatic, yet its effects rippled through every facet of their relationship, transforming casual games into conscious appreciation and playful tests into deliberate, thoughtful engagement. By the end of this period, she felt the first true sense of the consequences of treating love as a game, understanding that her past approach had relied on the rarest of human virtues, and that recognition, gratitude, and intentional action were essential to preserving and honoring the connection she had once jeopardized. The weight of realization settled more heavily with each passing day, and she began to confront emotions she had long ignored or dismissed. The playful detachment she had relied upon now felt hollow, replaced by an unshakable awareness of what she had risked through her games. Every morning, she noticed the subtleties of his care, the way he still remembered her preferences, anticipated her needs, and adjusted his schedule to ensure her comfort, but these acts were no longer automatic. They carried the quiet gravity of intentionality. She observed that his patience had limits, that his attentiveness now demanded acknowledgement, and that her previous amusement had obscured the true value of his constancy. Internal conflict surged as she replayed countless interactions with heightened clarity. The teasing she had considered harmless, the minor manipulations she had used to test him, and the casual disregard for his effort all assumed a new weight. She recognized that the foundation of their relationship had rested on extraordinary generosity and patience, qualities she had trivialized for the sake of entertainment. Each memory of his unspoken sacrifices, the early mornings spent preparing things she barely noticed, the long hours he adjusted to her schedule, the quiet ways he absorbed tensions she had created accumulated into a pressing awareness that her behavior had been reckless in its casualness. Guilt mingled with awe as she traced the countless ways he had prioritized her well-being without fanfare, illustrating the rarity of someone capable of such unwavering commitment. She began to see patterns she had long ignored, the repeated instances in which he deferred his own comfort, mediated arguments she instigated, and quietly absorbed her emotional volatility. Each recollection was a reminder of the extraordinary patience and care that had sustained her life and their relationship, and the realization brought with it an emotional weight she could neither ignore nor escape. Social contexts amplified this reflection. Observations from friends and family, once shrugged off, now resonated profoundly. They had long recognized his constancy, noting his attentiveness, reliability, and rare capacity for patience. She could no longer dismiss these comments. Instead, they acted as mirrors, reflecting the extraordinary reality she had failed to internalize. The contrast between her previous amusement and his steadfast devotion was stark, and she began to understand that the games she had played could have easily undermined what had been built with quiet dedication. Emotional tension in their shared life became increasingly apparent. Small lapses in his patience, subtle moments of withdrawal, and measured responses to her provocations highlighted the delicate balance he had maintained and the impact of her prior behavior. She felt the absence of effortless generosity, a gap that underscored the rarity of the care she had previously assumed to be infinite. In her private reflections, she catalogued the extraordinary gestures that had once been invisible, the way he noticed her moods, adjusted his plans without complaint, and consistently offered support even when unacknowledged. These observations intensified her awareness of her own negligence, magnifying the regret and urgency to act differently moving forward. She recognized that the trust, consistency, and emotional labor he had invested required conscious reciprocation and acknowledgement, qualities she had neglected in favor of amusement and control. This chapter of reflection deepened into a sustained reckoning. She began to internalize the moral and emotional lessons of her behavior, realizing that genuine relationships demand awareness, reciprocity, and respect for the extraordinary qualities that underlie enduring love. The awareness was not abstract. It shaped every thought, every action, and every interaction. Simple gestures, preparing a meal, leaving a note, offering help, now carried intentional acknowledgement, and she became acutely conscious of the necessity of honoring his rare generosity with deliberate care. Emotional maturity emerged as she confronted the contrast between her prior casualness and the measured patience he now displayed. The chapter culminated in a deep understanding that love is not a game to be won or a test to be passed, but a fragile, rare construct that requires recognition, gratitude, and conscious participation. She faced the sobering reality that her past behavior had jeopardized this rare connection, and that sustaining it moving forward demanded intentionality, humility, and a profound acknowledgement of the extraordinary patience and care that had been her foundation all along. Through this reflection, she began to reshape her approach to relationships, moving from self-centered amusement to deliberate appreciation, laying the groundwork for the restoration of trust, respect, and genuine emotional intimacy. The process of reckoning deepened as she faced the tangible consequences of her prior behavior. No longer could she rely on his patience as a safety net or dismiss his efforts as ordinary. Each act of care he offered now carried intentionality, awareness, and the quiet weight of boundaries she had previously ignored. She became acutely conscious of the rarity of his patience and the extraordinary depth of his emotional labor, which had long sustained a relationship she had treated as a playful experiment. The realization settled heavily on her, a mixture of guilt, awe, and a desperate desire to reconcile the imbalance she had created. In her private reflections, she catalogued the countless moments of unacknowledged support, the late nights he spent anticipating her needs, the small sacrifices he made without complaint, the endless acts of thoughtfulness that had been invisible to her amusement. She began to see that every playful manipulation, every teasing provocation, and every test of devotion had exacted a silent toll on him, demanding energy, patience, and resilience that she had assumed were inexhaustible. She observed the subtle adjustments in his demeanor, the slight hesitations, the careful measure in his interactions, and she understood that these were not signs of weakness or distraction but deliberate, conscious responses to the history of her behavior. The depth of his patience, once invisible, now appeared monumental, a rare quality that demanded respect, acknowledgement, and reciprocity. She felt the weight of her previous neglect pressing on her conscience, recognizing that her games had endangered the very connection she had secretly valued, and that sustaining his extraordinary care required more than casual amusement. It required deliberate participation and sincere appreciation. Social observations reinforced this understanding. Friends and family, long witnesses to his constancy, highlighted his reliability, emotional steadiness, and patience, illuminating the extraordinary nature of what she had previously treated as commonplace. Their observations acted as a mirror, reflecting not only his rare qualities but also the extent of her prior indifference. She realized that the foundation of love and trust she had relied upon had been built on the strength of his commitment, a commitment she had tested repeatedly, often without recognition or gratitude. Attempts at correction began, tentative and conscious. She made deliberate choices to acknowledge his effort, reciprocate his attentiveness, and approach interactions with awareness and humility. Every small act became an opportunity to demonstrate recognition, leaving notes of appreciation, engaging in thoughtful gestures, and actively supporting his needs alongside her own. These actions were neither casual nor performative. They were measured responses to a newly understood rarity, an effort to honor the extraordinary patience and generosity that had long sustained her life and their shared bond. The emotional labor required of her own awareness was profound. She had to retrain herself to recognize acts of care as they occurred, to internalize their significance, and to resist the habitual detachment that had once defined her behavior. Each interaction demanded intentionality, every response thoughtful, every gesture infused with acknowledgement and appreciation. The chapter unfolded as a journey from realization to conscious engagement, a recognition that sustaining rare love requires constant vigilance, empathy, and respect. The contrast between past negligence and present intentionality highlighted the fragility and value of the connection, reinforcing the need for deliberate, ongoing care. As she engaged in this process, the dynamics of their relationship began to shift subtly. He responded to her attentiveness with renewed warmth, measured engagement, and cautious openness, demonstrating that while his patience was extraordinary, it was not limitless. The reciprocity she now cultivated became the essential mechanism for rebuilding trust and honoring the care she had previously taken for granted. By the end of this chapter, she had internalized a profound lesson. Love is not a game, patience is rare, and genuine emotional investment demands acknowledgement, gratitude, and active participation. Every action she took was now a conscious effort to align her awareness with the depth of his care, to demonstrate respect for the rarity of his patience, and to cultivate a relationship that could survive beyond amusement, tests, and playful manipulation. She understood that the consequences of her prior games had been real, but that deliberate engagement, acknowledgement, and reciprocity offered a path toward restoration, teaching her the true value of a rare and extraordinary bond she had once treated lightly. The final chapter unfolded as a meditation on the rarity of true patience and the depth of genuine care she had long overlooked. She had moved from a place of playful detachment to a state of conscious recognition, understanding that the connection she had once treated as a game was built upon extraordinary emotional labor and consistent generosity. Every gesture he made once invisible to her amusement now carried profound significance, revealing the subtle ways he had nurtured the relationship with thoughtfulness, consistency, and unwavering patience. She catalogued the countless small acts that had sustained their bond, the meals he prepared without complaint, the careful timing of his attentiveness, the silent sacrifices he made to accommodate her whims, and the quiet ways he absorbed tensions she herself had
Thanks for watching. It means a lot. Share the video, and I'll see you soon.